March 2021. The investigator returns to the house on Vial Street, not on assignment, not on orders, because of a feeling that has given him no peace for 3 months. He enters the empty house, puts on gloves, climbs to the second floor. The room at the end of the corridor. That room. The door is sealed. He taped it shut himself back in November, signed it himself. The seal is intact, the lock untouched. But under the door, the smell. That smell. Sweet, heavy, almost floral. He recognizes it instantly, because every single one of them mentioned it. All 5 residents, one after another. Every one described it the same way, and every one of them, after that smell, changed. The investigator opens the door. The room is empty. Nothing. Only the smell. Dense, almost tangible, as though someone has just stepped out. And then he notices something on the floor, right at the threshold. A small object that he personally sealed in a clear evidence bag, labeled it himself, and handed in to the evidence storage facility 3 months ago. The object is here, in a sealed room, in an empty house. How did it get here? To answer that question, we need to go back, to the very beginning, to the first family that stepped through the door of this house. And to what became of them. Vial Street, a quiet residential neighborhood on the edge of a small provincial town. Trees along the pavement, low fences. Houses mostly built in the post-war years, solid, low-set, thick brick walls and small windows. Number 18 differs from its neighbors in only one way. It has been sold 5 times in the last 12 years. Each time, quickly. Each time, below market value. Each time the new owners left without staying longer than 8 months. The estate agent who handled the last 3 transactions, a woman in her 50s, careful, accustomed to not asking unnecessary questions, would later say one thing. Each time she came to collect the keys from departing residents, she noticed something changed in them. Not outwardly. Inside. Something in their eyes. Something in the way they moved. As though they had gone quieter. As though something in them had become less than it was before. She never spoke of this to anyone. She kept working, kept selling. But in private conversations, after the story came to the attention of investigators, she used the same word every time. Hollowed out, she said. They all left that house. Hollowed out. The first family moved in 18 years ago. A young couple, husband, wife, a 3-year-old son. They bought the house with money they had saved, did some light renovation, planted a kitchen garden. By every measure, an ordinary, happy family that had finally found their own place. The first few months, everything was fine. Then, the first signs. Minor, almost imperceptible. But it is precisely there that everything begins. The neighbor from number 22, an elderly woman who had lived on Vial Street for 40 years, recounted all of it calmly, but in great detail, like someone who had kept silent for a long time and had finally been given the chance to speak. The young wife from number 18 had been sociable. For the first 3 months or so, she greeted people regularly, sometimes brought over tomatoes from the garden, once asked to borrow salt. Everything normal. Then something shifted. She began greeting people less often. Then she stopped making eye contact at all. Then she started taking a different route, the long way round, through the far gate, anything to avoid crossing paths. This took roughly 5 months. The husband, according to the neighbor, changed differently. He became quiet, almost soundless. Before, his laughter had been audible from behind the fence. You could hear him humming to himself as he worked in the garden. Then, nothing. Silence. The house seemed to have swallowed him. The neighbor said, "I saw him once in the upstairs window. He was just standing there, looking out at the street, not moving, for a long time. I waved to him. He didn't react, just kept looking." The child, who was about 4 years old by then, said something strange to the neighbor through the fence one day. He said, "Someone lives in the walls of our house. He breathes at night." The neighbor thought nothing of it. A child's imagination. The family left 7 months after moving in. Without warning, almost overnight. They didn't take all their belongings. Some things stayed behind. A van came for the rest later, but the owners never appeared in person. The house stood empty for half a year. Then a new family arrived, and everything repeated. The investigator who took on the case at the house on Via gathered testimony from all 5 families. It was a long process. Some had moved to other cities. Some refused to speak. But the picture that eventually emerged was remarkably consistent. Every family went through the same thing, almost like following a timetable. The first 2 months, normal. A house like any other. Nothing alarming. The 3rd month, the first strangeness. Disrupted sleep. A feeling that someone else was in the house. Sounds that couldn't be explained. Creaking from places where nothing should creak. The smell. That sweet, almost floral smell, appearing and disappearing without apparent cause. The 4th and 5th months. Changes in the people themselves. Different for each family, but with a common thread. People became quieter, more withdrawn. They found it harder to make decisions. They began avoiding contact, not because they had quarreled with anyone, but simply because they didn't want it. They had no energy for it. One of the husbands, from the 3rd family, described it this way. "Every morning I woke with the feeling that I had been working all night, thinking, carrying something heavy. But I couldn't remember my dreams, just exhaustion. Constant, mounting exhaustion." His wife added, "He stopped laughing. Not because he was sad, he just stopped, as though the ability had gone somewhere." All 5 families left before a year was up. All 5, in different words but with the same meaning, said the same thing afterward. They were glad they had left, that they had managed to leave, and that the only thing they regretted was not leaving sooner. One question remained unanswered. What exactly was happening in this house? An architectural survey was supposed to answer it, but what it found produced far more questions than it resolved. The architectural survey was conducted by a specialist with 25 years of experience, a man accustomed to working with problem buildings. Unsafe structures, buildings with compromised load-bearing elements, properties due for demolition. A man not easily surprised. The house on Via surprised him. The issue was not structural failure. Not cracks, not the foundation, not the floor joists. From an engineering safety standpoint, the house was perfectly sound. But from the perspective of architectural geometry, the architect spent 3 days taking measurements. He measured everything several times over because the initial results seemed like an error. There was no error. The rooms in the house had been designed with deliberately distorted proportions. Not crudely, not enough to be obvious at first glance, but enough to exert a constant, imperceptible effect on anyone living inside. Walls that appeared parallel, in fact, diverged by 1 or 2 degrees. Ceilings that looked level had an almost invisible slope. Not the same in every room, but different. In the bedroom, the ceiling tilted one way, in the living room, another. The floors. This was the most striking discovery. The floors throughout the entire house had been laid with a deviation from true horizontal. Not a gross one, not enough to make objects roll, but a constant, continuous, invisible deviation of a few millimeters per meter of length. The human brain monitors the horizontal plane continuously. It is one of the basic mechanisms of spatial orientation. When the horizontal is disrupted, invisibly, persistently, throughout the entire house, the brain expends resources compensating for it. Constantly. Every minute. Every hour. Every day. This explained the exhaustion. This explained the difficulty concentrating. This explained the gradual fading. But it did not explain the smell. The next step was an investigation of the ventilation system. This was suggested by the architect himself, after he discovered that the ventilation layout in the house also deviated from the standard. A ventilation specialist with experience in older buildings spent an entire day in the house. By evening, he emerged carrying a thick folder of notes, and one very strange finding. In the basement, behind a false wall of plaster that looked structural but was not, there was a concealed ventilation chamber. Small, roughly 1.5 by 2 meters, completely clean, completely empty, but connected to the main ventilation channels of the entire house through a system of small openings, positioned so that air from the chamber would be distributed evenly throughout every room. The chamber was airtight. There was no entrance, only that plaster wall, which had to be broken through to gain access. On the floor of the chamber, traces. Old, dried traces of some substance, organic in origin, as the analysis would confirm. Plant-based. Signs of evaporation, as from a liquid that had once been poured in or sprayed and had since dried completely. This was where the smell had come from. What exactly had been evaporating could not be established. The substance had fully degraded. Chemical analysis returned only general indicators: organic matter, essential oils, something from the family of naturally occurring sedatives. Nothing specific, nothing provable. But the mere existence of this chamber, concealed, deliberately concealed behind a false wall, engineered specifically to distribute air throughout the entire house, pointed to one conclusion. This was not an accident. This was not a construction defect. This was intention. Someone built this house exactly this way, deliberately, with a specific purpose in mind. The question was, who and why? The investigator went deep into the archives. It took several weeks. The history of number 18 on Viazovaya Street turned out to be remarkably poorly documented. Not because the documents didn't exist, but because they existed as though deliberately scattered, as though someone at various points had removed individual pieces from different archives, leaving only what led nowhere. What could be established was the following. The house was built in the late 1940s. The person who commissioned its construction appeared in the documents simply as a private individual. A name, no position, no organization. Unremarkable on the surface. But the architectural blueprints were held separately, in a regional archive, and when the investigator finally found them, he stared for a long time at the signature on the project documentation. The plans had not been drawn up by a construction firm. They had been drawn up by the Department of Applied Psychology of Spatial Perception at one of the local institutes, a department that ceased to exist in the mid-1950s. The official reason for its dissolution: restructuring. What the department's work had actually consisted of could not be determined. Most of its documents had been destroyed when it was wound up, but several publications from the period, which the investigator found in library archives, gave some indication. The department studied the effects of the built environment on the psychological state of human beings. Specifically, it studied how spaces could be deliberately designed to exert a prolonged effect on the behavior and emotional condition of people living within them. In simpler terms, how to build a room that changes a person. The house on Viazovaya was, in all likelihood, one of the experimental sites. But who was the first person to live there? And did that person know they were part of an experiment? The first documented resident of number 18 was a middle-aged man. He moved in approximately 6 months after the house was built, in the early 1950s. Single, quiet. He worked as a lecturer at the same institute where the Department of Applied Psychology had operated. Whether this was a coincidence or not cannot be established. Almost no documents remain. But the neighbor on Viazovaya, the elderly woman who had lived there 40 years, told the investigator something important. She had been a small girl when this man lived in the house, but she remembered him well. He walked the street at the same time every day, morning and evening. Always the same route, always the same pace. She said he was like a wound-up toy, precise, predictable, no unnecessary movements. Then one day he stopped going out, for several weeks. Then he reappeared, but different, slower, quieter, as though he had somehow become smaller. She didn't know his first name, only his surname, which she had heard the adults use. The investigator found that surname in the Institute's archive. The man had indeed worked in that department. In his personnel file, in the field for reason of departure, there were 4 short words: resigned on health grounds. He left the Institute 11 months after moving into the house. He had stayed longer than any of the other residents. After leaving the Institute, he relocated to another city. His subsequent life left no trace in the documents, but the investigator found one record, a medical one, dated a year after his departure from the house on Viazovaya. The diagnosis was written in the terminology of the time, but its meaning was clear. Chronic exhaustion of the nervous system, loss of capacity for emotional response, partial amnesia. The system had worked. He had known how it worked, and still he had not been able to resist it. Let us return to the object, to what started everything. When the investigator found it on the floor of the sealed room in March 2021, he picked it up with gloved hands, resealed it in an evidence bag, and sent it for analysis, this time with a detailed brief. Determine origin, composition, age. The object was a small glass vial, dark glass with a ground stopper. Empty, or nearly, there was a barely visible residue inside. No cap, no markings on the exterior surface, no label. The analysis established the following. The glass dated to the mid-20th century, hand-blown, characteristic of small specialist workshops of that era. This type of vial was used primarily in laboratory conditions, for storing volatile substances. The residue at the bottom was organic in origin, traces of essential oils, likely naturally derived. A specific chemical marker that the experts described cautiously. A compound found in a range of plants known for their effects on the nervous system. In plain terms, the vial had been used to store and, in all probability, to disperse a substance that, when inhaled over a prolonged period, could produce a condition resembling chronic sedation. This explained the smell. This explained the exhaustion. This gave a scientific, cold, rational explanation for what had been happening in the house on Vyazovaya. But one question remained. One question for which there was no rational answer. How had this vial ended up in the sealed room? The investigator had packaged it personally, had handed it in personally. The evidence storage facility is a secure institution with an access log. The log was checked. No one had signed out this vial. No one had returned it. And yet, it had returned. After the vial was discovered, the investigator insisted on a full inspection of every concealed cavity in the house. It was an extensive undertaking. The house was taken apart carefully, methodically, wall by wall. 3 things were found. The first, behind the north wall of the basement, in a narrow gap between the brick masonry and the exterior cladding, there was a metal box. Small, soldered shut. Inside, several sheets of paper covered in small, dense handwriting. Notes, written in the manner of a journal. No dates, no signature. Judging by the style and terminology, written by someone with a scientific background, the notes described observations, the behavior of people in specific spatial conditions, changes in facial expression, speech, reaction time, deterioration of memory, reduction in emotional range. All of it documented methodically, like a scientific journal, without sympathy, without judgment, just data. The final entry was short, almost telegraphic. It read, "The subject has ceased responding to external stimuli. The experiment appears to have concluded. I intend to leave the object." The second, in the cavity beneath the staircase, there was a small wooden picture frame, without a photograph, just a frame, the glass intact, the frame empty. A nail on the back suggested it had once been hung somewhere. Where, unclear. There were no nail marks on any of the walls in the house. The third, the strangest. In that same ventilation chamber behind the false wall in the basement, the one that had already been examined once, a second inspection revealed something missed the first time around. On the ceiling of the chamber, in the far corner, several words had been scratched into the surface. With a sharp instrument, deep, deliberate. The words read, "I knew what it would do. I stayed anyway." Whose words were these? The first resident's? That lecturer from the department? Or someone else entirely? Someone the record never captured? Unknown. The house on Vyazovaya Street was demolished in the summer of 2022. The official reason, structural emergency. Technically, this was not entirely accurate, but the paperwork was drawn up in those terms. In its place now, a vacant lot. Grass. A few young birch trees that have pushed through the construction debris. Nothing to suggest a house was ever there. The investigator filed his final report. It recorded the following. The house had been built with deliberate architectural distortions that induced chronic disorientation in its residents. A concealed ventilation chamber had been found, believed to have been used to introduce a psychoactive substance into the air. A vial containing traces of that substance had been recovered. Written records had been found indicating that an observational experiment had been conducted in the house. The case was closed. Statute of limitations expired. The person who commissioned the experiment was never identified. No one was held responsible. All those involved had either died or disappeared from the record entirely. Everything logical. Everything explained. Almost everything. The vial is still in the evidence archive. The investigator checked personally, several times. It is there, in its place. But the neighbor from number 22, the same elderly woman, called him 1 month after the demolition. She said one sentence, calmly, without alarm, like someone simply passing on information. She said, "I walk past that spot every day, and every evening at roughly the same time, I smell it. That smell on the vacant lot, where there is no house." The investigator found no explanation for this. He is not looking for one, because he is afraid of what he might find.